Hello and welcome to DOZ Monologues, hosted by Etirivi Erebo. DOZ Monologues, also known as DOZ Chronicles Audio Stories, aims to educate, inspire, and drive societal change. All stories are written and narrated by Etirivi Erebo, and all rights are reserved, including the right of reproduction in whole or in part in any form. This is episode 15, titled Beyond the Mourning. If you are listening on YouTube, please subscribe, like, and share. Thank you. Beyond the Mourning. I lost my husband to death recently, but in truth, my loss began many years earlier. 15 years ago, I lost him to another woman, the very woman I had known since childhood, whom I believed to be my closest friend. It is a cruel twist of fate that the two people I trusted most in the world, the man I considered my soulmate and the woman I called my best friend, would betray me. The weight of such a tragedy is almost unbearable. My life was shaped by tragedy from the beginning. As an only child, I was born into loss. My father passed away just weeks after I entered the world, leaving my mother devastated. Her grief was so profound that she also died shortly after my 4th birthday. In those bleak and difficult times, I found a glimmer of hope when my father's elder brother, Uncle Mene, stepped in to care for me. He took me into his home, and from that moment on, he became the father figure I would grow up referring to as Dad. Uncle Mene was a prosperous man, whose success was reflected in his impressive 12-bedroom house situated on the riverbank in Sapele. The property was expansive, featuring not only the main house, but also guest bungalows and staff quarters, all of which spoke of his affluence and generosity. Aunt Alero, his wife, was a beautiful mixed-race woman whose long hair often captivated me. She embraced me lovingly as her own child. Her warmth and acceptance gave me a sense of belonging, and I was grateful to have someone in my life whom I could affectionately call Mom. Uncle Mene and Aunt Alero had 3 children, Warri, Temisan, and Toju. Warri and Temisan, who were 11 and 10 years older than me, respectively, were rarely home during my early years with the family. When I first arrived, they were away at boarding school and later went abroad for their university studies. As a result, I had little opportunity to develop a close relationship with them. Toju, on the other hand, was my age, and from the very beginning we formed a strong bond. People often referred to us as twins. During this time I met Kone. Her father, whom we all respectfully referred to as Mr. Sage, was my uncle's personal driver. Although Kone and her family lived in the staff quarters, she spent much of her time inside the main house with Toju and me. The 3 of us became inseparable companions, constantly embarking on new adventures and more often than not, getting into mischief together. Our friendship deepened as we progressed through primary and secondary school. However, after we completed secondary school, our paths began to diverge. My uncle arranged for Toju and me to continue our education abroad, while Kone remained in Nigeria to attend university. Although she was enrolled in a prestigious institution and my uncle generously covered her tuition, I sometimes wondered, after everything that happened later, if she felt any resentment about not being sent overseas with us. While in the UK attending university, I met Mofe, who later became my husband. His father, Chief Ayodiden, owned a group of companies and had acquired wealth that made my uncle look poor. He and I became casual friends. There was no romance and no sign that there might be. After completing our university studies abroad, Tojo and I returned to Nigeria, hopeful of resuming our lives with our family. However, our homecoming was tragically marked by the sudden deaths of Uncle Mene and Aunt Alero, who were killed in a helicopter crash while returning to Sapele from Lagos after attending a business meeting. Their unexpected loss plunged us into deep mourning and completely turned our lives upside down. The stability and comfort we once knew vanished almost overnight, leaving us to navigate a painful, unfamiliar reality. In the aftermath of this tragedy, significant changes occurred in our household. Tojo stepped into a leadership role and faced the difficult decision of letting go of some long-serving staff members. Among those affected was Mr. Sage, who had faithfully served Uncle Mene for many years. His departure was especially hard for us because it also meant saying goodbye to our dear friend Kone, whom we had only recently reconnected with after our time abroad. With Mr. Sage's severance package, he left Sapele to settle in Koko, where he began building a house and entered retirement as a farmer. This transition marked the end of an era, further distancing us from the familiar warmth and companionship we had cherished in our earlier years. I should have recognized that the unfolding events were a sign to reconsider my relationship with Kone, yet I chose to ignore them. Despite her relocation, I continued to invite her to visit, and she often accepted my invitations. During one of these visits, I ran into Mofe again. He was in Sapele for work, overseeing a branch of his late father's company. Both Mofe and I had changed significantly since our carefree days in England. I was still mourning the loss of Uncle Mene and Aunt Alero, while also helping Tojo with the family business as I tried to determine the direction of my life. Mofe was grieving too, having lost his father, and he had been thrust into a position of great responsibility, taking over as the head of a group of companies. On top of that, he faced external pressures to marry, which was perceived as a sign of maturity and responsibility in his new role. Mofe asked if he could come by to take me out for dinner, with plans for us to visit a nightclub afterwards. Since Kone was staying with me at the time, I initially declined Mofe's invitation because I didn't want to leave her alone at home. When I explained my reasons to Mofe, he was understanding and suggested that Kone could join us for the evening as well. "I'll bring Sodi with me," he said, and explained that Sodinye Dagogo Jack was an old family friend. Because of his exceptional intellect, Sodi had received a scholarship to study abroad from Mofe's father, and upon his return was now working as a general manager at an oil and gas company in Port Harcourt. He was currently on annual leave and spending time with Mofe. Later that evening, Mofe and Sodi arrived at the house to take Kone and me out for a night on the town. I had no romantic interest in either man. I simply wanted to enjoy a pleasant evening. However, I couldn't help but notice Kone's shifting attention between the two men, which I found fascinating. Initially, Kone seemed particularly drawn to Sodi, mainly because he was the one driving the luxurious car, a vehicle that belonged to Mofe. When it was time for us to leave, Mofe settled into the back seat, while Sodi took the driver's seat. At that moment, Kone turned to me and said, "Sit behind if you don't mind," and promptly climbed into the front seat next to Sodi. By the end of the evening, however, Kone's attention had clearly shifted. After our time at the nightclub, as we were preparing to head home, she realized which of the two men was more affluent, Without hesitation, she climbed into the back seat with Mofe, leaving me to join Sodi in the front. Her actions made it clear that her interest was influenced by what she perceived as greater wealth or status, and I could only watch the situation with a mixture of amusement and bemusement. Although I found Kone's maneuvering between Sodi and Mofe amusing, I didn't dwell on her actions because at that point, Mofe had not expressed any romantic interest in me. However, events soon took a different turn. The following week, Mofe visited me at home for lunch. Afterwards, we had a private, candid conversation about our futures and together decided to get married. There were no grand gestures or extravagant declarations, just a simple, honest discussion between two people considering what will be best for both of us. Mofe, who lived in Warri, was preparing to return there and desperately needed a wife so he could look good in front of his board of directors. Meanwhile, I was eager to leave Sapele, a place that now felt desolate without Uncle Mene and Aunt Alero. I also believed that starting a family might help me cope with my grief. Our relationship was not a whirlwind romance. Instead, it was a sensible arrangement between two old friends who had shared a close bond during our 3 years studying abroad. At that time, I felt that our friendship and mutual understanding would be enough to build a life together. As we began to plan for our wedding, Kone visited Sapele very often to help out. And it was during this time that I discovered that she was pregnant with Sodi's child, and he had asked her to marry him and she had accepted. In hindsight, I think that once it became clear she was not going to get Mofe, she latched onto Sodi, who, though not as rich as Mofe, was rich enough to provide her a better lifestyle than she had been born into. Sometimes I reflect on why Mofe chose not to marry Kone from the beginning. The only explanation that seems plausible is that at that time, Mofe faced pressure not just to get married, but to marry someone deemed suitable by those around him. When comparing Kone and me, I fit more neatly into his social sphere. In the eyes of his board of directors and perhaps the wider community, I was a more appropriate candidate for his wife. It was not merely about personal preference or affection. Rather, his decision appeared to be significantly influenced by societal expectations and the need to project the right image to those who scrutinized his every move. Our wedding was a grand affair, with Mofe and me surrounded by family, friends, and the who's who in society. Toju graciously took on the role of my late father and walked me down the aisle, which meant a great deal to me. Kone stood by my side as my maid of honor. Unfortunately, her pregnancy was not yet apparent, so her dress was a perfect fit. Throughout the preparations, and even on the wedding day itself, I occasionally noticed Mofe stealing glances at Kone when he thought no one was watching. However, I didn't dwell on this, confident that he had chosen to marry me and that Kone was engaged to Sodi, the father of her child. After the wedding, Mofe and I settled in Warri and embarked on the next chapter of our lives together. Kone moved to Port Harcourt, where she and Sodi eventually married and began their own family. Toju continued to live in Sapele and married his longtime girlfriend, Sisan, who welcomed me as a sister and helped strengthen my bond with Toju. On weekends, I often traveled with my children, Ama and Noyo, to Sapele to visit Toju and Sisan. Their two sons, close in age to Ama and Noyo, made those visits enjoyable for all the kids. My friendship with Kone also continued, and in hindsight, that was a huge mistake. Kone and her daughter Boma became regular visitors to our home in Warri. Boma was a lovely girl and Kone's only child, as she had found it difficult to conceive again after Boma's birth. Sodi's passing further complicated matters. Sodi's unexpected death in a car accident in the 12th year of their marriage was a devastating shock to Kone, plunging her into a deep period of mourning and forcing her to confront some uncomfortable truths about her life. Until that point, Kone, like me, had been a stay-at-home parent, largely unaware of the intricacies of how Sodi supported their lifestyle. After his passing, the reality of their financial situation became evident. Sodi's business, which he had established a few years into their marriage, had been struggling, particularly in the year leading up to his death. The company's poor performance had placed a significant strain on their finances, a fact that Sodi had carefully concealed from Kone. In the wake of his death, the extent of their financial troubles became clear. Not only had Kone lost her husband, but she had also lost the business and many of their assets. Much of what Kone and Sodi had built together, such as their home and other possessions, had been mortgaged. With Sodi gone, Kone was left with little to her name. The combined loss of her husband and their financial security left Kone facing an uncertain and challenging future. Recognizing the immense loss and emotional turmoil Kone faced after Sodi's death, Mofe and I decided to support her during this difficult time. We offered to buy her a new home and took on the responsibility of handling her bill payments. Our intention was to ensure she felt comfortable and secure until she was ready to either remarry, find employment, or start her own business. Since Kone wanted to leave Port Harcourt to escape the stigma and gossip that followed her after Sodi's passing, we purchased a house for her in Warri to provide her with a fresh start. However, after Kone moved to Warri, I began to notice significant changes in my marriage. Mofe's work commitments intensified. He traveled more frequently, and his trips were noticeably longer. Even when he was home in Warri, he would leave for work before I woke up and return late at night, often after I had already gone to bed. This growing distance between us was unsettling, and I found myself seeking comfort in my friendship with Kone. Since she was still within the traditional one-year mourning period, Kone was not allowed to leave her new home. I visited her regularly, and together we discussed my concerns about Mofe's altered behavior and the increasing strain it placed on our marriage. "Omasan, men cannot be trusted," she said to me during those times. "Look at how Sodi died, leaving me without a penny to my name." Soon, even Kone became hard to see. When I called at her home, the maid said she had a difficult night grieving for her late husband and didn't get any sleep. She is currently taking a nap. When I expressed my loneliness to Mofe, he suggested I visit Sapele to spend some time with Toju and Sisan. He was scheduled to travel again for a month, and our kids were away at boarding school, not returning for the holidays for just over 3 weeks. "If you go to Sapele for 3 weeks," he said, "you'll have enough time to return and welcome the children home without staying here long enough to feel bored. The driver will take you there, and he will come to pick you up when it's time for you to return." I traveled to Sapele to visit Sisan, who like me was a stay-at-home parent, with her children attending boarding school. We spent 3 weeks chatting, cooking, shopping, and attending events with her friends. Despite our activities, I couldn't fully enjoy myself because of ongoing worries about my marriage. The day I was supposed to return home arrived, but the driver didn't show up as expected. I called him, but he didn't answer. My attempts to reach my housekeeper were also unsuccessful. When I tried to call Mofe, his phone was switched off. My heart raced, though I tried to brush aside the warning signs that had been bothering me for the past 3 weeks. Tojo and Sistan arranged for their driver to take me to Warri, and I set out. If I had known what awaited me in Warri, I would have chosen to stay quietly in Sapele. The first sign of trouble came when I arrived home, and the gate man refused to open the gate for the vehicle to enter the premises. I was so shocked by this development that I got out of the vehicle and walked to the gate. "Edema, what is the meaning of this nonsense?" I asked. "Didn't you realize I was in the vehicle? Will you open the gate this instant?" Edema averted his gaze. "I apologize, madam," he said. "However, I have instructions from my employer not to allow you entry to these premises again." "What do you mean by that?" I asked, completely stunned. My heart raced in my chest like a wild stallion. Edema didn't answer my question, and honestly, there was no need for him to do so. Just then, Kone, who I might add was visibly pregnant, appeared on the balcony, rubbing her belly. She wore a brightly colored dress, signaling the end of her mourning period. "Edema, who is honking so loudly at my gate and disturbing my peace and sleep?" she asked. Kone spoke to Edema, but her attention was clearly directed at me. I stood outside the gate, separated from my own home and unable to enter. I felt frozen, rooted to the spot as I stared at her. My gaze was drawn to the baby bump she was gently rubbing. A sardonic, triumphant smile spread across her face as she looked back at me. Stunned, I stood with my eyes wide and my mouth agape, trying to process the scene unfolding before me. Suddenly, everything became clear. Mofe's recent behavior, particularly his eagerness to help Kone and her daughter through a financial crisis after Sodi's death, started to make sense. It also explained why Kone had stopped seeing me and why Mofe had asked me to travel to Sapele. He wanted to give Kone, who had completed her mourning period, the opportunity to move into my home. I wasn't sure when Mofe and Kone's affair started, but I remembered catching Mofe watching her with the same loving gaze I'd seen Toju give Sisan many times. Without saying a word, I turned around on unsteady legs that felt like they might give way beneath me. Luckily, I didn't have to worry about whether I could make it back to the car, because Toju's driver, who had clearly been watching the entire scene and understood exactly what was happening, jumped out of the car. He wrapped his arm around me and guided me back to the seat I had vacated moments before. As he helped me fasten my seatbelt, I heard him mutter under his breath, "It's okay, ma'am. Let me take you back home to Sapele. You'll be fine there." His kind words gave me hope after so much hostility and betrayal, moving me to tears. On the way, he called Toju to explain the situation, while I sat silently in the back. Back in Sapele, Toju and Sisan awaited me. Only then did I break down and weep in their arms. Toju arranged for my belongings to be sent to Sapele. He chose not to confront Kone or Mofe. I settled into one of the guest bungalows, where Toju took on his role as my protector and provider, a role he fulfilled admirably. My children joined me during the holidays, and over time, they occasionally visited their father at his office, but never returned to the house we once shared. That place had become Kone's territory, and everything associated with me was no longer welcome there. For 15 years, I felt not only abandoned by Mofe, but also completely disregarded by his entire family. During this time, I received occasional snippets of information about Mofe and Kone. Through these updates, I learned that Kone had given birth to a daughter with Mofe. I also found out that Mofe had formally adopted Kone's eldest daughter, the child she had with her late husband Sodi. He gave her his surname, which she used alongside her biological father's name. Then came the day that changed everything. Mofe suffered a stroke and was rushed to the hospital in Warri. My son Noyo, who had trained in America as a cardiologist and was working in a hospital in Lagos, quickly traveled to Warri to be by his father's side and to better understand his condition. Ama, however, was unable to rush to her father's side as she was newly married and living abroad. "How is he?" I asked when Noyo came to see me later that night. He shook his head. "He won't make it." Noyo hesitated, his brow furrowing as he gathered his thoughts. I watched him closely, my heart pounding in my chest, as I braced myself for whatever revelation was about to follow. "He is dying, but that's not all." He regained consciousness and spoke with me. According to him, Kone, his wife, and their oldest daughter, Boma, pushed him from the balcony. The fall caused the stroke and other complications. He asked his lawyer to come, and in my presence, he changed his will to name you, me, and Ama as the beneficiaries of his estate. He also expressed his regret, not only for how he had ended things with you, but also because he had recently altered his will to remove us entirely, making Kone and her children the sole beneficiaries. I sat in silence, reflecting on what Noyo had said. Had Kone pursued Mofe solely to claim his estate? Had she persuaded him to disinherit his children and then attempted to kill him to ensure he couldn't change his mind? A few days later, Mofe died in Noyo's arms. Kone, who had been arrested alongside her daughter for attempted murder, was now facing a murder charge. After his death, Mofe's family came to visit, and their intentions were clear. They needed a widow to mourn him. Since my bride price was never returned, I remained technically his wife according to native law and custom. After being forced out of my home for 15 long years, I returned not as a wife but as a widow. There was no celebration or sense of triumph in my return. Instead, I was overwhelmed by the somber duties that come with mourning. In the weeks that followed, as preparation for Mofe's burial took place, I fulfilled the obligations expected of a grieving widow. In the meantime, Kone and her daughter were facing trial for their actions, while her daughter born to Mofe was disowned by his family. Despite outward appearances, my role as the bereaved widow was performed solely out of respect for my children. In truth, the emotions required for genuine mourning had long since left me, as my heart had parted ways with Mofe many years ago. However, playing the grieving widow was worth it, as I would learn shortly after the funeral when the will was read. Mofe had left my children and me very well provided for, and on that note, I could not fault him. I immersed myself in the mourning season, but as I did, I also made plans for my future. I was now a very wealthy woman with control over my finances, no longer under Mofe's influence, dictating where I could go or what I could do. My children had long since left the nest, and Noya was set to marry once the year-long mourning period was over. I promised myself a tour around the world, during which I intended to fully enjoy and spend the money Mofe had earned. Money that Kone could no longer touch, even though she had tried to oust me from it. The end. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of episode 15 of DOZ Monologues. DOZ Monologues will return next week with another episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave your comments and subscribe, like and share if listening on YouTube. To contact me, please visit my website eturiviarebo.com or email me at eturivi@eturiviarebo.com. I invite all story lovers to explore my novels and novellas available on Amazon and Google Books. For audiobook enthusiasts, they are also on Audible. Thank you for listening. I am your favorite storyteller, Eturivi Erebo, and I'll be here next Friday with another story.